The most powerful empire on earth depended on a neighborhood so crowded and flammable that people joked it might burn down the city in a single night. Subura was that place, a dense valley of smoke, shouting, and cheap wine tucked right behind the shining marble forums of ancient Rome. From a distance, it looked like a stain at the edge of power. Yet once you stepped into its alleys, you found the beating heart of the capital, where shopkeepers, migrants, and hustlers kept the city alive in ways the senators on the hill rarely admitted. In this story, we are not walking with emperors through palaces. We are following the people who lived in cramped rooms above their shops, who dodged falling tiles in the street, and watched the elite hurry past with averted eyes. Subura lets us see an empire not from its triumphal arches, but from the staircases that creaked under the weight of the poor every single night. Before we continue, make sure to smash both the like and hype buttons and subscribe to our channel for more ominous history videos. We greatly appreciate your support. Where was Subura in ancient Rome? To understand why Subura became the city's most infamous slum, you have to picture its place on the map. It lay in a low valley squeezed between the Quirinal, Viminal, and Esquiline hills, where rainwater once collected and mud clung to sandals. As Rome grew, that hollow space filled with streets like the Argilatum and the Clivus Suburanus, busy roads that funneled people and goods from the residential hills down toward the political center. Over time, builders packed every spare plot with tall apartment blocks and street-facing shops, so that sunlight struggled to reach the paving stones and voices bounced from wall to wall like echoes in a cave. This geography made Subura a crossroads where senators might pass through in their litters, soldiers might tramp by on their way to the Forum, and the poorest citizens might never leave its shadowed lanes, all breathing the same air, yet living very different lives. 1st century BC Julius Caesar childhood in Subura. Long before statues of Gaius Julius Caesar rose in marble squares, there was a boy waking up to the sounds of vendors and carters in a modest house near the crowded streets of Subura. His family was old patrician stock, but money and influence did not always keep pace with ancestry, so the young Caesar grew up far from the quiet luxury that many imagined for Roman nobles. When he stepped outside, he saw laundry hanging from balconies, smelled frying food from street stalls, and heard quarrels and jokes shouted in accents from every corner of the empire. For a child, this was not yet a political education, but it was a daily lesson in how many kinds of people lived under the same Roman sky, from shopkeepers and freed people to beggars and clever street children who survived by their wits. As Caesar moved from childhood into his teenage years, the world beyond Subura grew violent, and the neighborhood gave him a front-row seat to the way power struck ordinary lives. His uncle by marriage, Gaius Marius, became a towering figure in Roman politics, while enemies like Lucius Cornelius Sulla turned the city into a battleground for rival visions of authority. When Sulla seized control and began his deadly proscriptions, fear ran through the streets, not only among senators, but also among shopkeepers, who wondered which patron or relative might vanish next. Caesar himself was briefly marked for death and had to disappear from the city, an experience that must have made the muttered conversations he had heard in Subura's taverns feel suddenly more urgent. In place of abstract speeches about the state, he had memories of neighbors whispering about soldiers, lists, and fortunes destroyed overnight. Those early years near Subura left scars and gifts that shaped the man Caesar became. Growing up close to Rome's poorest residents taught him how to speak in a way that cobblers, porters, and market women understood, and later he used that skill to build a powerful bond with the urban crowd. When he championed debt relief, grain distributions, and land for veterans, he was not just repeating slogans learned in a school of rhetoric. He was calling back to faces and voices he had known from cramped streets and smoky stairwells. His walks through Subura had shown him that an empire rests on workers who never see the inside of a senate house, and that resentment can simmer for years in the shadows of great buildings. The adult statesman, who crossed the Rubicon with an army behind him, had once been a young man weaving through Subura's alleys, and that memory of life at the edge of grandeur helped him understand how dangerous neglected people can become when someone finally offers to lead them. Roman tenements and Subura slumlords. If Subura had a skyline, it was not made of domes and temples, but of insulae, the multi-story apartment blocks that loomed above the streets. Builders raced upward, with brick and timber, squeezing tiny rooms around narrow stairwells, because land at ground level was more valuable than safety standards. Wealthy investors purchased these blocks as rental properties and rarely lived in them, so they enjoyed the income while tenants worried about leaking roofs, cracked walls, and staircases that groaned under the strain. In a place like Subura, a family might crowd into a single smoky room on an upper floor, boiling food over an open flame and praying that the boards beneath them would last another winter. Fires started easily, and when one did, those on the top stories had the furthest to run and the least chance of escape, while the owner might simply collect insurance or rebuild, treating human disasters as a cost of doing business. For the people who lived in these buildings, the fear of collapse or eviction was simply part of everyday calculation. A tenant might weigh whether to pay a slightly higher rent for a lower floor, knowing it was safer in an emergency, or to gamble on the cheap attic room that came with a terrifying staircase. Slumlords negotiated through agents and managers, rarely meeting the faces behind the coins, while landlords could profit from overcrowding without ever smelling the mold or hearing the babies cry at night. When writers complained about greedy owners and dangerous housing, they often had districts like Subura in mind, where profit rode on the backs of those who had nowhere else to go. The tenements of Subura were not just buildings. They were machines that turned anxiety into rent money, one cramped room at a time. Life in ancient Rome's largest slum. Walk through Subura at midday, and you would meet a crowd that did not resemble the marble statues of Roman heroes. Freed people who had once been enslaved ran small workshops or rented stalls, determined to secure a future for their children in a city that still remembered their old status. Migrants from Italy and distant provinces spoke with different accents and brought unfamiliar foods, hoping that the capital would reward their courage in leaving home. Street vendors sold bread, olives, and hot stews to workers who had no time or space to cook, while water carriers, porters, and casual laborers waited for any job that might cover a night's rent. Among them moved sex workers headed toward discreet doorways, and foreign worshippers gathering for local cult meetings or small synagogue services, layering new traditions over the old Roman fabric. Subura was less a single community and more a crowded patchwork of families and individuals, all inventing ways to survive in the same confined space. Red light district of ancient Rome. When daylight faded, another side of Subura emerged as lamps flickered on in taverns and alleyways. Cheap wine shops filled with drinkers whose laughter could turn into arguments without warning, while innkeepers watched both the door and the coin box with practiced eyes. Behind plain wooden shutters, brothel keepers managed networks of rooms and workers, offering services to sailors, soldiers on leave, and curious visitors from better quarters who came to sample the city's forbidden amusements. Gambling tables appeared in corners, dice rattled across makeshift boards, and fortunes vanished faster than the wine jugs emptied, feeding a cycle where some residents floated between work, debt, and occasional crime. Ancient moralists painted these streets as places of constant temptation, but for many in Subura, vice was not just recreation, it was business. A way to generate income in a society that offered few respectable options to the poor. The neighborhood kept its reputation as a red light district because the economy of pleasure and risk was woven into its stones. Roman street gangs and Subura collegia. Subura did not need famous crime bosses to be dangerous because its streets could fill quickly with organized muscle whenever powerful men required it. Neighborhood clubs known as collegia offered fellowship, shared worship, and burial funds, yet some also acted as ready-made crews loyal to local patrons. When ambitious aristocrats like Publius, Clodius, Pulcher, or Titus, Annius, Milo sought to dominate city politics, they relied on armed supporters drawn from busy working-class quarters, the kind of men who drank in Subura's bars and rented in its tenements. These followers could escort their patrons, break up rival meetings, and even clash in violent street battles that alarmed the Senate and disrupted daily life. The sources rarely label a particular group as the Gang of Subura, yet the geography of the conflict shows that neighborhoods like this provided much of the manpower. In a city where power often depended on persuasive crowds, the tough young men of Subura became an unofficial army long before any emperor raised a standard on the frontier. 64a The Great Fire of Rome. Among the fears that haunted Subura's residents, fire was the most justified, and the disaster remembered as the Great Fire of Rome turned those fears into history. Wooden staircases, cooking fires, oil lamps, and crowded workshops created perfect conditions for a spark to become an inferno, especially in lower-class districts where streets twisted and buildings leaned. Ancient accounts place the origin of that devastating fire in a zone of warehouses and shops near the circus. And many modern historians see Subura or its surroundings as a likely starting or feeding ground, the kind of place where flames could run unchecked. As the blaze spread, the cramped alleys that had always trapped smoke and noise now trapped heat and panic, forcing families to choose between jumping from upper windows or sprinting through burning courtyards. In the aftermath, as ruins smoldered and rumors blamed everyone from careless merchants to the emperor himself, Subura stood as a grim example of how the urban poor paid the highest price when the city they served went up in flames. For Augustus, the threat from Subura was not only physical but symbolic, and his answer reshaped the skyline. He ordered the construction of a massive fireproof wall at the back of his new forum, a solid barrier that separated the marble temple of Mars the Avenger from the maze of slum housing behind it. Officially, this wall helped stop fires from leaping into the monumental center, but its presence also sent a message that the worlds of senators and slum dwellers should not mix too closely. From that point on, visitors entering the forum saw a gleaming public space that pretended the smoke and shouting just beyond the wall did not exist, even though the people of Subura still heard the echo of official ceremonies. The stone barrier did not remove poverty, it simply framed it, turning the neighborhood into an unseen backdrop for imperial self-presentation. Martial and Subura. If you want to hear Subura speak, you turn to the verses of Martial, the sharp-eyed poet who wrote about the everyday life of Rome with more honesty than most official inscriptions. He complained about neighbors who practiced singing at dawn, barbers whose clattering tools and gossip never stopped, and carters who blocked the narrow streets while shouting at their mules. His poetry describes stairways slick with spilled water, air thick with cooking smoke, and doorways marked by symbols that hinted at the kind of services offered inside. Yet amid the discomfort, Martial also noticed the small rituals that tied people to their streets, like garlands on tiny shrines at crossroads and offerings left for household spirits in cramped rooms. Through his words, Subura becomes more than a stereotype. It turns into a place where humor, frustration, and fragile affection coexist, giving the slum a human voice that still carries across the centuries. Subura today, Monti district in Rome. Today, if you walk through the Monti district of Rome, you are treading on ground once covered by Subura's insulae and alleys, although much has changed. Broad avenues cut by later governments slice through what were once tangled lanes, and fashionable bars now occupy spaces where ancient wine shops once stood. Archaeologists have traced the lines of old streets and uncovered fragments of wall and pavement, including sections of the Great Barrier that Augustus built behind his forum, still standing like a stone witness to the boundary between glory and hardship. Locals and guides may point out where Julius Caesar is believed to have lived, or where the old tenement quarters clustered, inviting visitors to imagine the vanished rooftops rising above their heads. In this way, the memory of Subura lingers not as a shameful secret, but as an essential part of Rome, reminding anyone who listens that no empire, however radiant its monuments, can exist without the crowded neighborhoods that feed, clothe, and sustain it far from the spotlight. If you made it this far, thanks for watching, and make sure to smash both the like and hype buttons and subscribe to our channel for more ominous history videos. We greatly appreciate your support. See you in the next video.